Welcome back. You're watching and listening to Breakfast with Anne and Martin this morning. It's 7:41 and we're going to meet our headline makers now. With us this morning, Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and Emma Wolfe, who's writer, columnist and journalist and friend of the programme, friend of the station. You're on all the programmes at the moment. Fraser, first of all, hurricane victims are demanding more help. Which hurricane was it and where? This was
Hurricane Otis in Mexico, and it was one of the strongest hurricanes that has ever hit the Mexico on the Pacific coast. And about a month on, people still, their lives are still in tatters, unfortunately. You know, so they're demanding more help from the authorities. The president has announced a sort of $4.5 billion package, which is, you know, gives you an indication of the damage that's been done here. I mean, obviously, you know, this is a deeply, deeply tragic event. It's also destroyed the sort of tourist industry in that particular area. But, I mean, the one thing that's often forgotten is that the context now is that the damage being done by hurricanes and extreme weather is actually going down.
Yeah.
Contrary to the sort of renewed focus on it because of climate change, actually fewer people are dying every year, less damage is being done because we are, as human beings, getting better and better at building and at creating safer buildings, at creating better things like flood defences and all kinds of things like that. So, you know,
that's
the
a very
overall
interesting
story
fact,
is
because the perception is different, isn't it?
And the BBC Panorama actually had to issue a correction because they simply asserted, you know, they did this thing on climate change and they said wild weather is killing more and more people, and they had to correct it. You know, all the scientists said no, this is not true. This is a perception. So yeah, even if the weather is getting worse, actually we are getting so much better at dealing with it. So there's a kind of a good news story there.
It's funny the kind of the things that we choose to focus on, because we haven't heard a lot about Otis. No. But do you remember Hurricane Katrina and the huge media coverage? It's funny the things that we care about or that we send aid to or that we kind of, you know, splash all over the front pages and on the screens, and it's sort
probably
of, this
because it was America versus Mexico.
A bit under the radar.
Sad but
of
true,
course,
you know.
New Orleans versus Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah, but Katrina, we didn't rush help to Katrina, did we? I mean, that's the scandal of it.
Yeah.
Is that people are still suffering after Katrina.
Yeah, that's true. That was certainly the perception of it in the United States, that, you know, George Bush wasn't interested or didn't get on the ground.
Not for days and days and days.
Right, from hurricanes to underwater mountains.
Yes, what's this all about?
Can I give you the technical term, which I've learned, and another thing I've learned this morning, seamount. So that we don't call them sea mountains, we call them seamounts. And this is an underwater seamount which has been discovered off the coast of Guatemala by scientists. They do this kind of mapping the seabed. It covers 5.4 square miles and it's over 1.5 kilometres tall. It's 5,200 feet tall.
So if it were not under the sea, we would see it as a blooming great mountain.
Massive. It's twice the size of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. Twice the size.
Wow.
1.5 kilometres high. These things are really good news. They're biodiversity hotspots. They're great for coral, for creatures, for all sorts of kind of biodiversity. They can hang to it. But scientists think there could be up to 100,000 of these undiscovered seamounts.
Wow.
We know so little, though,
I was going to say, is there any news? Is it a volcanic seamount or is it just a
It's
heap?
just like a mountain, I think. Well, I mean, I'm sure it's far more complicated than just like a mountain.
I like stories like this because it makes you realise that there's so much yet to discover.
Well, there's much more under the sea than there is over, isn't there, in the world?
Exactly.
Well, we think we know the planet.
And we
seem to know much more about space. Exactly.
And we send billions out there.
And, you know, as we saw with that horrible tragedy in the summer, it's so difficult for human beings to be able to go and explore. But even it seems that, we haven't even sort of mapped it digitally, despite all the tools we have.
We obviously are beginning to, aren't we?
Yeah.
And that brings us neatly on to this next story. It sounds very exciting to me, having 2 young children, a robot that can pick up messy clothes.
So this robot thinks it has solved the teenager problem, essentially. So it's got a robotic arm. That might not sound in and of itself impressive that it can pick up clothes. But what it does is it sort of grabs them and then puts them together into a pile and then grabs a few at a time in order to be as efficient as possible.
If you're listening on the radio, I'm afraid we are seeing what is very clearly a robotic arm, and it is picking up, one by one, bits of sort of underwear on the
But what's it
floor.
doing? OK, can we be clear? Is it sorting out that's dirty, that needs to go in the laundry, that's been tried on and needs to go back in the cupboard? What's it actually doing?
I don't think it's that advanced. It's basically
I think
picking
it's
up anything.
transferring the problem from one bit of floor onto, you know...
That's a very good point, because anyone who's ever had children, particularly
Yes.
boys, I think, but it must be with girls as well, is that you have gone to all the trouble to launder their stuff, and you've ironed it sometimes, and you've folded it, and you've put it in their drawer, and then they go and try it on and think, oh, I don't want that, and they chuck it on the floor.
Sorting things out, which is the
and you know that there are things on the floor that are not dirty. In fact, just about 24 hours ago, you were ironing them. And that, I don't know whether that robot is actually doing that
I don't want
job.
it just putting them all in a little plastic tub, and then you have to deal with the plastic.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's kind of not very helpful.
I think robots are a bit rubbish, aren't they, if you think about it?
Yeah, they are, and it's amazing
we'll promise
how
so much.
For all the fear mongering about we're going to have robots taking over the world, killer robots, Terminators. I mean, they are just rubbish. There are so many things. They're so limited in what they can do. Maybe that's because we haven't invested enough money in them, right?
If they were inside a bigger industrial process, you can see that they are very... I mean, we have robots that assemble cars, don't we? Very clearly, within a particular process,
For home
robotic
stuff,
arm
not that
can
good.
work.
But you remember those things that sort of zoom around the floor and are meant to vacuum? They look great, but if there's stuff in the way, they don't work either. They don't pick things up and put... It's putting things away and sorting things out, which robots aren't really doing.
Robots are meant to take over the world. They can't even tell if a pair of pants is clean or not.
No.
That's not world domination.
And even in a sort of Amazon warehouse where you think that's exactly the kind of thing you'd want to automate. The problem is they can't pick things up and then put them somewhere else.
No.
They have real difficulty dealing with objects of different sizes.
Folding. I mean, folding is a very complicated process to fold something and put it away, or to hang something up on a hanger.
Yeah. No, I find that very difficult.
Yeah.
But I used to have...
say ironing. What's
I used to have one of those...
What's that?
Well, I certainly don't do that anymore. I used to have one of those robotic hoovers. And you know how when some people, if they have a cleaning lady come round, or a cleaning gentleman, I suppose, you end up tidying up for them.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I used to have to tidy up for my robotic hoover because of the very thing. If it came across a pile of clothes...
They'd bump into a wall, didn't they?
It would bump and bump and bump and probably get all tangled up. And in fact, once upon a time, when I first had my little doggy, she did something by accident on the floor, and the robotic hoover spread it all around the carpet.
Oh, yucky.
So, they're not as clever as they would have us believe.
Yeah.
Robots are rubbish is that story, basically.
Yeah, sort it out, Rishi.
Yeah.
Basically, still need women to do the housework is the answer.
Here we go.
You still need women to do the hoovering, and you still need women to pick up the clothes.
Yeah.
Right, royal book exclusive, Emma. Is there anything left in this book that we haven't heard?
It's a not exclusive from me, I'm afraid. Yeah, so this Endgame, which we thought we'd reached the end of the Endgame.
This is the new book by Omid Scobie.
It hasn't even come out yet, and I'm sick of it already. It's actually due to be released on Tuesday. It's been heavily trailed. Is there anything new in this? It's full of recycled stories, gossipy stories about, as Fraser was referring to, the toothbrush issue with Prince Charles.
Yeah, so people have known for a long time that Prince Charles gets one of his servants to do his toothpaste for him, and he likes an inch specifically on the toothpaste. Shows what the kind of pampered Charles is. But yeah, this story appears in this book as if it's like a new revelation.
Everybody's known that
we've
story.
known it for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, there are probably more exciting things.
And it's full of sort of, Prince Charles is said to be furious about Harry for this, that, and the other. So it's kind of it feels very much like he's scraping the
king
barrel
now.
here.
Don't forget. Apparently he says that the king. Called his son, called Harry...
A fool.
That fool. That fool, yes.
Yeah.
And I can imagine him grumping, saying, he's being a fool, or something.
And also, if someone is going to splurge, revelations about the family all over his memoir and everything, you are going to tend to draw back and not talk about him. And apparently King Charles was saying, we shouldn't talk about things in front of Harry. Well, that's because, he's proven that he's not to be trusted.
I mean, he calls William a hothead who embraces dirty tricks. That's what Omid Scobie says. Somebody says about William. I don't think that's actually attributed to Harry, but we all know that must be Harry. And says some particularly cruel things about Kate.
Yeah, it does. It talks about Kate being, just basically doesn't have the confidence, just turns up and smiles at kind of public events and things like that.
Which we know is not true.
Yeah,
because we see her.
It's patently not true.
Pliable,
she's brilliant.
he says that
she behaves herself.
She has been
with
infantilised
decorum.
by the way the palace use her. But that's blatantly not true. We've just seen her launch a big campaign,
That's right, yeah.
and she's throwing herself into it. And she's a very good public speaker.
South Korean
actually.
trade deal. You know, she was kind of rolling out the royal carpet to the president of South Korea.
She does excellent work on mental
key
health
moment
and
of a
young
huge
children
trade
and-
deal. This is nonsense.
Why do you think he's called it Endgame? What's the point he's trying to make?
He's trying to make the point that this is the beginning of the end of the royal family, that he even makes a claim about William possibly being the last, the last ever king. It's all this kind of grandiose stuff. And the sources are pretty much based on nothing.
Yeah.
Di Davies, the former head of Royal Protection, says this is clearly a hatchet job. I don't know the relationship between father and son, but they've always seemed close. I wouldn't trust a word this Scobie says, and where he gets his sources from is debatable.
Well, that seems to be the most sensible thing been said about it so far. Fraser, let's get some juicy politics on the go, shall we? The election that's rocked Europe in Netherlands, Geert Wilders pulled off a shock victory.
Yeah, I mean, it's to call it a shock is an understatement in many ways. I mean, even he and his party had no idea how successful they were going to be. They actually booked the venue for their sort of celebrations only 3 days before the election because they didn't know they were going to pull off this massive victory. And what's extraordinary is that the Netherlands is one of those countries where lots of commentators have said, oh, they don't do populism there. It's a sensible country. People are very moderate. There's an incredible Financial Times profile just a week before the election saying the mood of the country is for moderation. Yeah. And there we go, people voting for Wilders.
But just like Brexit, just like Trump, they spectacularally misread the electorate.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of issues people are angry about in the Netherlands. Migration's a common one. But one that's under discussed is the sort of net zero question. Wilders is very much a climate sceptic, and his main rival, Frans Timmermans, was essentially the head of the EU's climate policy. He quit the EU to contest these elections. And, there have been huge protests in the Netherlands with farmers protesting against, stringent nitrogen emissions rules in this case.
The government bought land and forcibly removed farmers from having a livelihood.
Exactly, and thousands of farms are due to close in order to meet these emissions targets. So it goes to show that, people are not going to just tolerate the evisceration of their livelihoods just because it's hidden behind high-minded talk about net zero.
But isn't this feeling, as you say, of not reading the room properly, not reading the electorate properly, and also the fact that electorate have had enough, they've had enough. Yeah. It's actually happening in many countries.
It is, but it's not just not reading the
Argentina.
room. It's more that if you make people feel ashamed of voting for Trump or voting for Brexit, they won't tell you. They will not tell you. There were so many shy Brexiteers, quiet Brexiteers, shy Tories, all of that. If you make people feel that they're idiotic and xenophobic and, bigots, for voting for Trump, say, or any of these far-right,
I called them the silent Trumps in America.
Yes, exactly. Well,
Sorry, it's an old joke.
And they're silent Brexiteers, and many people...
But they roared in the Netherlands, and an interesting thing is, on his referendum pledge was a vote to leave the European Union. Exit.
Yeah, and people...
Netherlands exit. Right.
People across Europe are extremely dissatisfied with the EU, and I don't know why it's sort of imagined... we just happen to be the country that held an in-out referendum. Britain is not special. And, you might remember a couple of years ago, Macron admitted, if the French had an in-out referendum, we probably would have voted... they probably would have voted leave.
I don't think they will. I don't think they will.
The euro makes things more complicated, and people then worry about, if my savings... what happens to my savings if we have to change currency? But, would people... so perhaps people wouldn't necessarily want to leave as such, but people are very Eurosceptical in Europe.
20-1 outsiders, the Netherlands. That's, the favourite is Italy. Italy is 7-1.
Italy. Is that
right?
right?
And then it's like Spain, France. So they are outsiders. I don't think that Holland would vote to leave the EU if it went to referendum. I think they're socially conservative, as they're a bit afraid of doing so. Nevertheless,
things can change.
This guy has rolled a hand grenade into establishment politics. Yeah, he really has.
Yeah, absolutely. And people across Europe, sort of centrist liberal parties in particular, need to be very aware of this. They're next.
Could it happen here? Is the next big question.
Well, we're paused on the edge of voting for a Labour government, aren't we? That's what we're led to believe.
What about the next
But are
cycle?
we reading the room wrongly? I don't know.
Do people feel they have any choice? Do people feel that they have any other options? They don't want to vote Conservative because they're not Conservative any longer. But we don't I mean, what else happens? Maybe Reform and Reclaim and all of those smaller parties do split the vote and mess it all up, and Labour come in. It's such a different...
It is. We're going to have to wind it up there, I'm afraid. We're coming to the end of this hour, as they say. But obviously we've got an awful lot more to talk about with the release of many of the hostages, including that lovely little 9-year-old Irish-Israeli girl, Emily Hand. We'll be back with you in a few moments.